Alright, how's it going, y'all? Today we're going to be talking about how to use a Raspberry Pi as a Plex server. So basically, this will allow you to have all of your media in one centralized location and really easily access it anywhere on your network or even outside of your network if you buy the Plex Pass, all while being hosted on a super cheap Raspberry Pi. So I'm going to be doing this on the Raspberry Pi 4, and honestly with Plex, you're going to want something as powerful as you can get. So the Raspberry Pi 4, honestly 4GB or even 8GB of RAM is probably going to be helpful if you're going to have multiple playbacks. I do want to get something right off the bat. You're not going to be able to do any kind of live transcoding of video on the Raspberry Pi. You can do offline, it'll just take a long time, but anything live where it's like transcoding on demand, you're not gonna be able to. The CPU in this thing is just not fast enough at all to be able to transcode videos. So if it's a 4K video, you're going to have to send the 4K video. You can do an offline transcode if you need to do that. All right, so first, let's talk about what Plex is. Plex is an application that basically searches a folder that you set up for movies and TV shows. They have a very specific naming convention where if you follow it, it will basically scan a bunch of libraries of what TV shows and movies are out there, and it will grab things like thumbnails, titles, actors, all those things just based off the title. And so when you are putting your DVD collections and whatever onto this server, you do need to make sure they are named in the proper convention or Plex might not find it. Plex can also do a bunch of other stuff. It can also basically transcode video. So that means if the video is 4K in a certain container type, but the player that you're using does not support that, it can either transcode it to a different container type to send it over, or it can also downsample it to 1080 if it's a 1080 TV and you don't have the bandwidth. And so Plex can do that on more powerful servers, but unfortunately, even with a Raspberry Pi 4, you're really not gonna be able to do that. You might be able to get some really low resolution stuff out of it, but I would not count on it at all. Really what this is gonna be is a direct play where it's just sending the file over the network, which is honestly really easy to do. So what you can do is you can actually pre-transcode everything, just make everything 1080 in like H.264 where everything can play that. And basically choose that for your entire media catalog, and that way you never have to worry about it not working, or you can always upgrade to like a more powerful build for actual transcoding. So the way I've set this up is I've actually just set this up with a SSD that has both the operating system, and we're also going to be using it for media storage. What you could also do is hook up an external hard drive to this and get 16 terabytes for super cheap and have all of your movies just on that. And so it's really up to however you'd like to do it. I'll go ahead and leave a link to how to set up an external hard drive in the description below. The next thing is how we're getting the files on the Raspberry Pi. You can either just put them on the hard drive and have it like an ext4 if you're running Linux. You could also run exFAT, but I've got a tutorial on how to set that up with a Raspberry Pi. Or the easiest method that I would highly recommend is setting up a simple Samba server. And I'll go ahead and leave a link to that in the description below. Basically what that allows you to do is connect to this shared hard drive from anywhere on your network and just start dumping files on there. And then Plex will be able to grab those files and send them out for video watching. But the way I'm going to be doing this is I'm actually just going to copy one of my videos and stick it on there using SCP. It is definitely not the most efficient, and it's going to be pretty annoying if you have to do this a ton, but I'm just going to be doing this for 1 or 2 videos, so it's not that big of a deal. All right, and so now we're just gonna go ahead and SSH into a Raspberry Pi. And so the first thing you're gonna wanna do is run a sudo apt update to make sure you have the most recent package links, and it's just good to upgrade. And then if we had any packages that were not up to date, it's probably a good idea to just do a sudo apt upgrade. But we don't need to do that. The next thing you're going to want to do is set this up with a static IP address on your network. I would recommend having your router hand this MAC address a static IP address every single time. Basically, it's called a DHCP reservation. So just search DHCP reservation and the name of your router. And that way your Raspberry Pi always has the exact same IP address whenever it's on the network. And so that way you always know how to connect to it and you can get to it really easily there. And so I've already got that. So now we're actually going to go in and install Plex. And so the way we're going to do this you can just do a sudo apt install Plex, but it's actually going to be the old version of Plex and it's not as updated as often. So if you want the most up-to-date version, and especially for security updates, you're going to basically want to add in the package from Plex. And so we'll actually just follow their instructions for how to do that. So we're going to go in here, and I've already gone to this link. Basically, it's a link for, hey, how to install Plex. And I'll go ahead and leave this in the description below. And we're just going to go scroll down until we see Linux. And so you could just download the Debian package and basically just install it there, but you wouldn't get any of the super easy Debian package updates. So what we're going to do is we're going to click this link, enable repository updating. And so the way we're going to do this is we're actually basically just going to add Plex's server as part of our apt update. So that way, whenever we run that, it gets those packages from Plex directly. And so whenever Plex puts out an update, we get it immediately. And so they've already set this up incredibly easily. And for Debian-based distros, which Raspberry Pi is part of, we're going to just run this command. And so what this first command is going to do is going to say, put this line right here at the end of this file. So what this is basically saying, hey, we want to add in this package in our apt sources. And so that's what we're going to do first. And so now we basically created this Plex Media Server list in the sources list. And so now we actually need to add in the key. So the way we know that this has not been messed with is the key. And so we're just going to do a curl, grab the key. So this is going to grab the key and it's going to add the key to our apt update system. So we're going to copy it and just paste that in there as well. And so just like that, we've got the key in there as well. And so that way we can authenticate and make sure we're getting packages from the correct thing. And so if someone were to somehow compromise this, they could not get us to add packages that were unsecure. And so now we're actually going to rerun sudo apt update, because now we have another package list to look from. And so now, as you can see right here, there's this plex.tv version that is now in our repository list. And so now that we've got this in here, all we have to do is type in sudo apt install Plex Media Server. And so it will just do this all for us. And so now we are actually grabbing the packages directly from Plex rather than going through the Debian package manager, which is both good and bad. We get updates much sooner, especially for security updates where that's really important. But it also means that things are not going through the Debian package system that is very well controlled. We are essentially just having to trust Plex, but hey, that's okay. All right, and so now it's just asking us, hey, we see that you've got this other config file right here, and that's the one that we created, and it's run into kind of a conflict. And so we are going to say no. We want to keep our currently installed version, the one that we manually set up. So we're going to hit N, or you can just hit enter. All right, and so now, just like that, we've installed Plex. And so now it should just be running on our IP address. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do an IP ADDR to figure out what IP address we're at. So I'm just going to copy this right here, and we're going to go to it on our web browser. So we copied it, and I'm going to type that into our web browser, and we're going to paste in port 32400, which is the port that Plex runs at, and /web. And just like that, we are now connected to our Raspberry Pi Plex build. And so now it's just going to give us a overview. And so we're just going to go ahead and set this up. So it's going to get us, hey, buy our nice Plex pass. But I'm going to say no, I've actually already got it. They were nice enough to give me one. And we're going to call it Pi. And so this is the other option. Allow me to access my media files outside my house. If you tick that, it will attempt to use universal plug and play on your router to open up a port. That can be a security vulnerability, so I would recommend actually just setting up a VPN server, and I've got a tutorial for how to do that on a Raspberry Pi, and using that to connect instead, which will be much more secure. But in all honesty, you're probably fine if you leave that open, and if you have universal plug and play disabled on your router, you just have to forward the port manually. And so now we just need to create a library. I'm gonna call it movies. And we'll create a media folder. And we're just gonna go ahead and put it in our user folder. So that is going to be root, or slash, which is the same thing, home, pi. And we'll select that to be the folder. Really what you should do, and I'm actually gonna do this because it's probably for the best, we're actually gonna go back into terminal and we're going to do an ls, or a pwd, and so we can see we're in the home pi user, and we're going to make a folder with mkdir, and we'll call it movies. And so now there's this file movies in there, and that's what we'll actually select. And so now we'll just add that, and you can add these on later on easily. And it's download the Plex apps, yada, yada, yada. And so now it's gonna say, hey, look, you can get all these wonderful apps. You can also sign in and a bunch of stuff like that, but we do not need all this stuff because it's just Plex spam that they've been trying to get. And so we're gonna go into more, and we're going to go into movies. And so it's going to say, sign in to claim the server. This can allow you to essentially hook up Plex and have Plex manage it. It's really up to you. I would not feel uncomfortable having this server claimed by Plex, and it just makes management a lot easier. So you can either choose to sign in to claim the server, you'll need to create an account, or don't show this again. And so currently the library is empty. So what we're gonna need to do is we're gonna need to add a video to it. And so as I said, I'm gonna do a very slow, very annoying copy of a file over using SCP. And so the way I'm gonna do that is I'm actually just gonna exit out of my Raspberry Pi real quick. And now I'm going to go into /edit, basically the place where the files are. And I'm going to say the Raspberry Pi Wi-Fi router. So I'm gonna cd into that. And so I've got a few different options here. Basically, this is a huge file, but this is my 4K video that I'm going to select here. I don't even know if this Raspberry Pi will be able to handle it because it's super high bit rate that I upload to YouTube. But we're going to do an SCP. So we're going to do SCP, where the file currently is. Sometimes it's easier to just put it in a string, and that way the spaces don't matter. And so we say where the file currently is, and now we say where it's going. And for that, we're going to use the sign in. So we're going to do just how you would SSH. So we're going to do pi at the IP address, / where to go. And so that is home /pi /movie. Movies. And so we're going to hit enter on that, and it should copy it over. We'll say yes, we want to connect. And we'll sign in with a password. This is the password for the Raspberry Pi. And so now it is successfully copying that file over. And so it's going to take a minute because it's quite a large file, as I said. Whew. All right, and so finally it transferred. It was going at 45 megabytes per second when theoretically it could have gone up to 120. I think it's the SCP is not great for multi-threaded. I definitely have been able to get a Raspberry Pi to write a lot faster, so I'm not totally sure what the bottleneck there was. I think it really was just SCP. But now that we've done that, the file has now been transferred from my local computer to my Raspberry Pi via SCP. And as I said earlier, go ahead and check out the link in the description for how to set up a Samba server, and just set up that Samba server and then point Plex to wherever you host it. And that way you can just, using Samba, copy files over, and it's a lot easier. And so now what we need to do is we need to make sure this Plex user has access to this file. And so I'm gonna go ahead and SSH back to my Raspberry Pi. Clear to give us some space. And now we actually need to grant the Plex user access to this file system, to those movies. And so I'll do an ls, and we'll even cd into the movies file, and we should see it. And so just like that, we now have those files over there. So I'm gonna do a cd ... to go back. And so right now, currently Pi owns this folder, and the Plex user needs to own it. So to do that, we're going to do a sudo chown to change ownership. We'll call it Plex for the user, the folder, and we'll do a -r for recursive. Whoops, it's a big R. And so now if we do a ls-l, we'll see that Plex owns the folder. If we cd into movies and do another ls-l, we'll see Plex also owns the file, which is important. And so now we can go back into our Plex library and it'll say, hey, the library is currently empty. We'll just hit manage library and we'll scan the library files and we'll go back into movies. And so just like that, we now have the video. So I can just go ahead and click play on this. All right, so now we're back in movies. I did quickly have to go through and actually retranscode the video because that full 7 GB super high bitrate video file that was 4K absolutely demolished my Plex on my Pi, so I downgraded it significantly so it would work. You're going to have to figure out what settings work for you and for what will work on your network. And so now we should be able to just hit play. I've not tested this yet, but I'm really hoping it'll work. All right, how's it going, y'all? Today we've actually got and that is really low quality, but it works and it loaded really quickly. I did cellular low using compressor to encode the thing just to make sure it would work for this. You definitely could do higher quality than this. It is absolute potato quality, but it loads super quickly. As you can see, the entire file's already basically been loaded and you can just jump around really, really quickly, which means we definitely have a lot more to work with. You gotta mess with your settings. You gotta see what file formats work, and you are going to probably be having to use FFmpeg to encode things to what file formats you need. But if you have just a few videos, you can actually probably make a batch script that goes through, and maybe your Raspberry Pi takes a couple of days to do it. But hey, what else is it doing just sitting there? So those are some things you can work on. But yeah, that is how you use Plex. So currently, as you can see, it's just the name of it. But if I were to go in and rename this, you could rename it to a different file and it would basically go through its database to figure out what the name should be based off the way you name it. And so if you go in the installation script, it actually tells you exactly how to do it. So if you follow these formats, it'll just work pretty well. All right, and so just like that, that is setting up Plex on a Raspberry Pi. It's honestly really straightforward, and as long as you don't try to shoot a super high bitrate video, it actually can handle a fair amount. Just remember your browser is also going to have to be able to handle whatever files are on there because you're not going to be able to do any kind of transcoding because that CPU is just not fast enough yet. All right, well, that's going to be it for this tutorial. Go ahead and leave any of the tutorials you'd like to see me make, especially Raspberry Pi ones, in the comments below, and have a good one. Bye.